Hi, this is Alex McKean, and you're listening to Post-Mortem. In this episode, I speak with David Mulroney, president of the University of St. Michael's College. Last fall, Mulroney penned a letter describing what he sees as a major disconnect between USMC admin and student life. He called it two solitudes, no more. Subsequently, leaked Snapchat videos involving former and then current SMICSU reps precipitated the prorogation and eventual dissolution of the union. All of this has made USMC ripe territory for debate over the extent to which admin should or should not get involved in their affiliated student societies. Last week, after our interview took place, the executive summary of a months-long financial investigation into SMICSU was released, details of which are summarized in the Varsity. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, Mr. Mulroney.
Thanks for coming by.
Very good. So today we'll be talking about the relationship between divisional societies and the administrations that are associated with them. It's been a pretty active year in that regard here at St. Michael's College. So I wanted to start from the beginning, which is to say when you first took on the role as president here. It was a little less than 2 years now, I think, in July of 2015.
About a year and a half, just a little more.
About a year and a half. Yeah, there you go. So at the time, you'd had a very active career, very distinguished career. You were part of the Foreign Service and ambassador to China for 4 years between, I think, 2009 to 2012. Is that right?
For 3 years, yes.
For 3 years, there you go. And so it seems to me like you could have had many possible options for a second career. What prompted you to come back here to your alma mater?
Well, what I did first was, when I got back in 2012, I worked at the Monk School for 3 years as a senior fellow. I'm still a senior fellow at Monk, and I wrote a book on Canada-China relations, and I was just finishing up that book, and the Basilian Fathers, the order of priests who founded St. Mike's in 1852, still are present on campus, came to see me to ask if I would take up the job of, be willing to be considered for president. I think there had been a search that was problematic, sometimes happens in university life. Mm-hmm. And I said, that's not my background, I come from a different set of experiences, but they persisted, and I said, I'll come and I'll do my best. I love this institution. I'm a graduate of St. Mike's. My mother was a graduate of St. Mike's, my sister, my daughter. So lots of family connections. And I've had a lot to learn in terms of running a university. But there are some commonalities in terms of being a senior administrator in government and at a university, and I've been able to tap into some of that. And I've always been conscious, and particularly in dealing with our own student government, of my own experiences and what I've learned over 30 plus years in government, and I've tried to share some of those experiences with the folks at SMICSU.
Right on. So you did an interview with the Varsity back then when you first took on the role, and I wanted to read just a very small excerpt from that interview, which I have here. You said, in big, complicated organizations, there's a very strong tendency for individual parts of it to want to do their own thing. The danger there is that these components lose track of larger objectives. You need leadership to bring those different component parts into focus so you're achieving greater objectives. And I think when I read that at the time, I thought you were referring to SMC and its role within the University of Toronto as kind of a large organization. But looking back on it now, it seems like it almost foreshadows the Two Solitudes letter that you wrote and the sorts of divisions that you referred to between the administration at St. Mike's and the student organizations. Were you thinking about that at the time when you spoke to us about that?
No, to be honest, I wasn't. What I was thinking of was what I found when I got here, and that is that you have a large undergraduate division, the college, and our students at that level are also members and parts of the Faculty of Arts and Science. We have a graduate division, the Faculty of Theology, we have a library, we have a continuing education division, we have broader administration. And what I found when I came to St. Mike's, and I think maybe one of the reasons I was asked to come to St. Mike's, was that they were operating in isolation to a certain extent, that the university was a little bit siloed. And I saw that I had the opportunity to apply some of the things I'd learned in government, because government also gets siloed. Individual departments do. When government as a whole tries to work together, that can be difficult. And I see my job as respecting the integrity and the specialization of each unit, but encouraging them to think, when it's appropriate and as appropriate, about larger objectives for the university. Because sometimes the smaller component can be so focused on its own ends that it may work to the detriment of the larger whole. And you know, for example, in work we have a fantastic library, and we've got a great chief librarian who's one of the best in the business, and I'm tremendously proud of the library. But sometimes my role is to say, it's great, let's keep building the library, but I have to be conscious of our larger budget. How big a library can we afford? What are the limits on that? And there's an excellent creative tension between us, but I have to think about our larger needs, and in supplying the library, in finding resources for the library, am I inadvertently starving another part of the university? So there's always this creative tension between nurturing the individual bits and thinking of the whole. And I think we're always best when there's a healthy interchange across all of the units. And that really wasn't there when I came to St. Mike's in 2015.
Mm-hmm. So how would you say that idea and that way of thinking would apply to the way that you think about the student organizations here? And like, what was the motivation behind the Two Solitudes letter that you wrote and the policy document that emerged from that, or that was referenced in the blog post?
The Two Solitudes was motivated by something else, and that is that I was struck by the fact that towards the end of my first year, in many of the events that I attended, and many of the the talks that were given, and the special events on campus, it was really meant more for the administration and the faculty to say, I found them very sort of staff-centric, that you'd hear a great speaker on an academic subject, but there'd be no students there. That the university had kind of turned in on itself and almost turned its back on its students. All of the discussions that I had with my senior colleagues, with academic staff, with administrators, tended to focus on the business of running the university, or on labor issues or labor management issues, and not all that often on student issues. And so I felt that we had become two solitudes, that students didn't attend a lot of events, they didn't really see themselves as part of the college, and we needed to address that. And I thought at the same time that from what I saw of the student government, they'd also kind of moved into their own space and were thinking about student affairs, but not as part of this larger entity. When I was here in the 70s, it was a more organic and connected place. We attended things, and you'd be at talks, and you'd see lots of faculty there and lots of students there. My professors would invite me, with my fellow students to dinners and coffees and things like that. It was a very rich community life, and I felt that was lacking. And that's the origins of Two Solitudes. Staff and students, faculty and students, looking in opposite directions and going in separate directions. And I thought that was unhealthy. Still do. Okay,
so a major component of what you wrote, the policy that you wrote, was centered around what you see as the mission and vision for St. Michael's College. And you describe it very much as a Catholic intellectual community. And that's something that there was a pretty major response to that particular point on the part of the students. Were you ever concerned that emphasis would alienate those students here who are not Catholic?
No. The Catholic intellectual tradition and Catholic universities have been part of many countries. If you look at, for example, I served in Taiwan. Taiwan is not a Catholic country, but one of its most vibrant universities is a Jesuit-run university in Taipei. Much higher education and secondary education in India was provided by Catholic institutions. You don't have to be a Catholic. The intellectual tradition isn't for Catholics only. It's not an extended catechism. It has to do with a way of seeing the world, a way of seeing literature and life, and respecting the fact that people can be. We use our minds, but we also use. We rely on faith. That the intellectual and the spiritual are equal parts of what we are. That's at the center of our vision. We're also an intentional community, meaning, as originally were Victoria and Trinity, that we didn't amalgamate with the University of Toronto. We didn't become a component of the University of Toronto. We federated with the University of Toronto because we offer this different vision, but it's a vision that has always welcomed people of different beliefs and people of no belief. But it is something. And if you stop being that something, then you just become another part of modern secular Canada, which is a big, wonderful place. But I think the world is more interesting when you also provide space for belief. And there are a lot of people who feel that way, and many of them come to St. Michael's. Some of them are Catholic, some of them aren't. But you have to know what you are. And I felt that one of the problems, and again, one of the things that had probably led to my coming to St. Michael's, was that it had lost this sense of itself, its sense of mission. And one of the things that I noticed in tandem with that I thought that its academic quality was suffering because it lost this sense of itself, what made it special. So I think that can be and is welcoming. It is something that is attractive to students of many backgrounds, and it is the value added that we bring to the University of Toronto. Is it harder to sustain that narrative in Canadian life? And even within the University of Toronto, it's much harder than it was when I was here in the 1970s. The space available for religious belief is smaller. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some space for religious believers. And I am sure of the fact that the University of Toronto is richer for allowing us to have this space. It depends ultimately on something that is very Canadian, and that is mutual accommodation. We work very hard to live within the secular space of the University of Toronto and of Canadian society. I live in that space. I spent 30 plus years in the Government of Canada, which is an entirely secular organization. Our new principal, Randy Boyagoda, is the president of PEN Canada. He contributes to the Globe and the CBC and the New York Times. He lives in the secular world, but he's also a really, really interesting Catholic intellectual and a novelist and someone who shares this. So he lives in both these worlds. And we think that there are a lot of students who are interested in doing the same thing. And the job of the president is to be the sort of chief mission officer, to remind the university of why it exists. And the University of St. Michael's College is, in its origins, the Catholic university in the University of Toronto. And we can't, if we forget that, we become less than we are. We can be. And we also really reduce the contribution that we can make to the University of Toronto.
Okay, so help me to understand what you're describing, the unique identity of USMC as a Catholic institution. How does that apply to, or how does it manifest, rather, when it comes to student organizations? And in the policy that you wrote on the student organizations specifically, it says that they should be motivated by this mission. How does that manifest, given that so many of the students here, I don't know, you might know better than I do how, like, the proportion of students who are Catholic or not Catholic, but how does that present itself in the activities of the organization and how they run?
Well, the initial, and the reason we're having this discussion is something that is a little bit more basic, and it's certainly part of Catholic belief, but it's part of, I think, broader Canadian belief. And the origins of this debate were partly not about religion, but about good governance and management. And it's a very Catholic way of looking at things, but it's also a very Canadian way of looking at things, that in addition, that with freedom and autonomy comes responsibility. The two are twinned. You don't get one without the other. And so early on, as I was working with SMCSU, and as I was being asked and to sort of sign a check for more than $100,000 to go over to SMCSU, I said, can you reassure me that you have the mechanisms in place to manage this transparently and fairly for our students? And this was in keeping with the best practice from the University of Toronto. And that began a discussion with SMCSU as I began to see more of how SMCSU operated. It generated some concerns on my part, but it also opened up what I hoped would be a very productive dialogue with SMCSU about financial management, that it needs to be, the qualities you invoke are probity and transparency and value for money, and also around activities and how people are treated. And this gets into some more issues of Catholic belief. So there were activities that I thought objectified people, that objectified women, some of the club nights and the things like the Cowboys and Schoolgirls event. I happened to be walking through Brennan Hall at one point where the Bachelorette auction was going on. And I sat down and I said, these things don't represent my values as a Canadian, and they certainly don't represent my values as a Catholic in terms of the respect we owe ourselves and the respect that we owe others. We also, very early on got into a discussion about Brennan Hall itself, and that's where the SMCSU offices are. And I found this, this is a small thing, but every time I walked through Brennan Hall, the air was sort of blue with the language that people, mostly a group of guys, were using, guys who clustered around the pool table. And I noticed it because I'd hear it, and then I'd see the woman who ran the Tim Hortons there covering her ears and sort of slumping down behind the cash. And then I began to hear from colleagues and students, many women, who said, we don't feel welcome in Brennan Hall. It's kind of a club space. It's a place that belongs to other people, and we're made to feel uncomfortable there. So I introduced that into my discussions with SMCSU to say, that doesn't represent Canadian values, and it certainly doesn't represent Catholic values. That to be part of this community, we at least expect you to show the same degree of respect for others, respect for their space, and respect for this place. These are some basic values that we ask of you. If you're going to live among us, respect the fact that some language we consider offensive, and some behaviors we consider offensive. These are very basic standards of accommodation that we ask for, and they're related to our Catholic identity, but they're also related to our Canadian identity as well. And because SMCSU carries our name, we also ask them to think a little bit about how they present themselves in public, because invariably that association with St. Michael's will be one of the first things that the general public sees. And so we would say you have a responsibility to think about what we stand for.
Right. So,
and just a final point, I had a number of discussions with SMCSU about, as they were talking about their activities. We at that point were trying to, and have now succeeded in, bringing a Syrian refugee family onto the campus. And the impetus from that came from the students in our Faculty of Theology. We have 100 students in theology. Last year we had more than 5,000 undergraduate students. And I said to SMCSU, the Faculty of Theology is prepared to raise a significant part of the money that we need to welcome this family on campus. Can you help? Can SMCSU help? You've got, many times the student base, they said, no, we don't think we can. It's really difficult. We've got our activities planned. And I remembered when I was at St. Mike's had a lot of fun activities, and it was known for being very high-spirited, but it was very socially committed. And student government was committed to social action, social causes, the great boycott. It was a place where, I worked at the Good Shepherd Refuge as a member of the St. Mike's community. We were really committed to making this city and the country a better place. And I didn't see any of that in the programming for SMCSU. I can't tell SMCSU what to do, but I do value the opportunity to sit down and engage them. I think that's my job. My job as the president of the university, my job as a guy who spent a lot of time in government, to at least start a discussion with them about things that I thought could be a better use of their time and of students' money, and of this shared space and community that we're part of.
So there are a couple points I want to circle back on there. You referenced the fact that SMC is a federated college, so it's
federated university.
University, part of the University of Toronto.
It's not part of the university. We're federated with the University of Toronto, and so our undergraduate division is the members of the undergraduate division are also members of the Faculty of Arts and Science. But we have a separate act with the Legislature of Ontario. We're owned privately. Much of our funding comes from private sources. So it's a rich and beneficial federation, but we're not a part of the University of Toronto in that sense.
Okay, so the University of Toronto has this thing called the Policy for Open, Accessible, and Democratic Student Organizations, and SMC, being a federated university, is not held to that policy. So is this policy the one that you wrote on student organizations? Do you see that as SMC's version of the policy on open, accessible, and democratic student organizations?
What I see it as is the mechanism that connects SMCSU and makes clear how SMCSU is governed, what its relationship is to the university, and what its relationship is to the ultimate governing body of the university, the collegium or board. So it's a pretty short document. It asserts its respect for student organizations and the autonomy of student organizations. It talks a little bit about the history of student organizations. It reminds SMCSU of some fundamental values that we have, and seeks to have SMCSU share in those values. It also asserts and reasserts the idea that we'll assign faculty advisors to SMCSU and to the other student associations, the Residence Council and the MIC. So it's a short document that tries to set clear the accountabilities that we have as the administration and that SMCSU has as part of this university.
Right. So I think my impression has been over the course of this year that a lot of the response, or you might even say pushback, that you've gotten as a result of this policy has been centered around the extent to which SMC as an administration can be involved in student organizations.
Sure.
So I guess
I think that the pushback predates that, though. So when we sat down with SMCSU originally, and this was a year and a half ago, to say, as we're transferring this money that's been collected from St. Mike's students, can you reassure us that you have in place the financial mechanisms to manage $140,000, with probity and with confidence? And it turns out, first of all, the books were in a mess. And in fact, they weren't sure what the books of the previous government were. Nor was there much financial management capacity within SMCSU. So we then worked and said, we'll help you find an accountant to manage so that the next government doesn't have to, because they said, well, every government just inherits a mess and we never know how much is owing or what we have in the, from, if there's anything left over. We don't really know what the budget was spent on. So we said, look, that makes me a little uneasy on behalf of our students. So let's get an accountant for you. We'll identify some people who'll do it at a reasonable rate. And we found a St. Mike's alumnus who was willing to work with SMCSU. And then I said, what I ask of you, if we're to sign this money over, is that you commit to two things. That you commit to providing full financial accounting at the end of the year, and you commit to an AGM at which time you report to the students of St. Michael's how you've spent their money, what the activities have been. And one other thing I asked was that they agree that they would not spend money from the student levy on alcohol. I said, because a significant portion of our students are underage. I just think that's the wrong way to spend money. So that's my personal request to you. And I met with SMCSU again and again, multiple times through the year, and I got ferocious pushback. And in the end, they did a fairly basic reporting, which now I find didn't cover a lot of their expenditures, and had something that looked a little bit like an AGM, but it was the lightest touch imaginable. And it was only after that year that I found out that some of the problems that I had worried about, such as misuse of funds, were happening. So there was ferocious pushback the year before to accept things that I thought were really in the interests of our students. And the argument used to push back is about student autonomy. But I think it was really the autonomy of the group of people who were running SMCSU, and they're still sort of at the heart of a lot of the pushback that we're still getting. I heard from a lot of students who were amazed at some of the things that their money was being spent on, who sought more information from SMCSU, and who, and this was the most depressing of all, I've heard from a number of students who were really dynamic student leaders in their high school, had approached the SMCSU administration to see if they could get involved in student government, and were kept out, who felt that same sense of exclusion in Brennan Hall that many report on. So my conviction from day one was that there were some real deficiencies. That was proved by the time we received some testimonials from people who had actually taken money, but since then I've still encountered a lot of pushback from people who are associated with SMCSU against opening things up so that our entire student body can understand how their money is being spent. So sometimes the autonomy argument is a smokescreen for accountability, and I think that's what's happening right now.
So, isn't there a tension somewhat between this point that is made within the policy, which is that SMICSU and the other societies here at St. Mike's, they should be accountable to those who elected them, and the idea that the fact that, in your opinion, they're not being accountable means that more oversight by the administration is required. Isn't that kind of a tension between the administration and the student body, let alone the organizations themselves?
I don't think so. I mean, we're more than an ATM in terms of handing over the money from the student levy. It would be irresponsible of us and of me to simply cut a check to an organization that had no financial capability and where we had some concerns about how money had been managed in the past. So that is a responsibility that I have. That's at the heart of the conversation that we're having with SMICSU. The other side of it is that we have already spent a great deal of time working with people who, on the finance side of SMICSU, training them, working with them on new methods so that they're not using cash as much, that they're better able to keep their books. And we have pledged to spend even more time on training, leadership training, financial management training, training in governance. So that doesn't encroach on their autonomy. I would like nothing better than for SMICSU to stand up and be running itself efficiently and answering to our students. But the truth is that we're a long, long way from that. And in the course of the conversations from people who came forward, it was a litany of examples of either outright malfeasance or the improper expenditure of money from students. And this was perpetuated by a kind of culture, and some of the students who came forward and gave testimony said, we felt that there were traditions that we had to keep, and that if I didn't entertain people at a pub or buy them a dinner, that I wasn't being a good counselor because that was the SMICSU way. And what struck me was that SMICSU had become almost a sort of a private club, a club that you belong to, and it was the club of the governing class of St. Mike's, but where people, and this happens in government too, had developed a real sense of entitlement, an entitlement culture that was basically cut off from the vast majority of our students and didn't feel accountable to them. And that's been reinforced by the testimony of several of the people who've come forward.
Right, but I think the question is, whose job is it to determine that is happening? Is it the job of the administration to step in and say, this is the wrong way of doing things?
If there's malfeasance happening, yes, it's the job of the administration. Otherwise, SMICSU is not going to change itself. I cannot sit by if the money from our students is being misused, and if people come forward and tell me exactly that it's being misused. And when I talked about the two solitudes, I felt that the administration of St. Michael's is responsible for part of this, for not being as engaged. And engagement with SMICSU doesn't mean dominating them or directing them. It means engaging them. I mean, I think I have something to share in terms of government experience. I spent more than 30 years in government. I think I have something. That's one thing. I'm not an academic and I'm not an academic administrator, but I could actually help. And I'm keenly interested in this. And it pains me when people give testimony, and I've heard this testimony, that because we worked really hard, we thought we were entitled to dinners and perks and off-site retreats and things like that, because that's what happens in government. And I said, you know what happens in government? We work so hard to be transparent. To when I was an ambassador, my expenses were made available online. I had to account for things. I didn't accept gifts from people. If I was invited to see somebody, I had to sort of report on who I was seeing. So that's not because I'm a virtuous person. It's because Canadians expect that. That's how the Canadian government works. And if you want, what you're talking about, folks, is not good governance. It's old-fashioned governance, and it's how government officials get into trouble. And part of what motivates me is to say, I don't want you to get in trouble. I wrote a previous president and vice president a letter prior to them going off on a retreat to Blue Mountain, asking them not to go on the retreat and explaining that one of the reasons for that is that eventually your electorate catches up with you. You can say, well, everybody used to do it, so it's okay. You don't want to be the group that gets caught. You don't want to be in the Varsity or the Globe and Mail for doing this thing. Off-site retreats, I said you could use any facility at St. Mike's. You don't have to spend money that way. And if it is an educational retreat, as you're describing, you should have an agenda, and you should be sure that you're avoiding things like the excessive consumption of alcohol, hazing, and games that get out of control. And then I found out that I spoke to them a month later after they'd gone on the off-site retreat, and they hadn't read my letter because they said, well, you sent it between governments and it just sat in our mailbox, but the old government didn't read it, neither did we. But I really felt that was a missed opportunity. And I had sat down, I'd written them a personal letter as someone who'd been in government to say, don't make these mistakes. That's not your money. It's money that belongs to the students, and you have to be sort of religiously committed to spending it for the students and not for yourselves. Do you know how many governments have cratered, have gone wrong? How many careers have been destroyed by people who've forgotten that? You need to learn that early, or the lesson when it does catch up with you will be very expensive and very painful. So much of this for me comes from my background in government, and I'm passionate about it.
Okay, so in the meantime, I wanted to make sure that we touch on what's happening now with SMCSU,
Yes.
or more accurately, perhaps what's not happening with
Yes.
SMCSU. So after the union was dissolved, we had a couple of students had come to us saying that these decisions were made behind closed doors, or that there was a lack of transparency going on. Can you comment on those and how those decisions came about, what's happening now, and what we can expect
Sure.
in the future?
So what I introduced with SMCSU was, when we meet, let's meet in the coop, which is an open student space, and we'll set a table in the middle of the coop. Students can be present, and let's have our meeting with people around us. So I don't engage in closed-door meetings with SMCSU. SMCSU then took a series of decisions that were kind of bewildering to, I think, all of us. People were either fired or resigned. They then determined that they would prorogue. People were communicating their status on SMCSU via their Facebook status. It was extremely confusing.
Are you referring to the time after the Snapchat videos were released at
Well,
that point?
there were actually things even before that where
Okay.
people either were fired or expelled, and right through that. And eventually they decided to prorogue. So with the administrative advisor on SMCSU, we sat down with the people who had prorogued and said, let's figure out what you've already approved by way of budget in terms of clubs and activities and musical events and things like that. And we'll continue to fund that with the people who are responsible and whom you appointed. We don't want to punish our student body because you prorogued, but we'll be very careful. And we asked a couple of times for an interpretation. If there was SMCSU had, from a fund they have, had agreed to do some repairs to the theater in Alumni Hall. And so we went back and said, can you verify, we want to be sure that you actually had a vote on that, and they came back and said yes. So we've been very careful not to punish, to be sure that we didn't punish students, but also to be sure that any money that was spent was money that was approved by SMCSU. Then we said in February, look, we're a month away from when you'd have your elections. So what we'd like you to do is to help us in the design of a questionnaire that we can send out to all of our students, asking them for ideas on reforms to student government, and to enable us to set up elections as quickly as possible for the next government. We're in the process of doing that now. The questionnaire is either out or will be out in another couple of days. There will be a committee drawing on students from each of the years from our undergraduate programs to help us set up the elections, and they'll be run according to guidelines set by students. I hope there will be people will take some time to learn some of the lessons from the past, and ideally we'll have a new SMCSU, a new student union in place by the end of the year. We've had, these are extraordinary times, but SMCSU essentially walked off the job, prorogued, said that they were no longer in the business of running the student union.
So just help me to understand or clarify, at the time that you had the meeting where you discussed the questionnaire. Was that the administration stepping in and saying this is no longer a prorogation? It's just going to end this council now, and we're going to redesign it?
Well, what we said was, it's now February, and your election is in March, so we've got to, let's start planning, and they weren't meeting, they weren't even basically talking to one another. Something needs to happen, and since you're prorogued, why don't we go out to the students as a whole and ask them for some basic advice in terms of the nature of a new government, and let's also see if we can bring students together to launch elections. Nothing was happening, and we might have reached the end of the year with SMCSU still in this kind of paralysis. So we thought we needed to intervene to make sure that there was an election before the end of the year, and I think that's the right decision.
So I want to just quickly ask about the financial investigation that we reported on it back in August. And I believe that there was a statement on the USMC website at the time saying that once that investigation had been completed, it would be public and we would hear about it. Do you have an update on how that's going?
I think, and I hope it will be completed this month. It's been extremely time consuming because it's gone back for about 5 years. No adequate records have been kept over that time. So that's involved a forensic accountant and a great deal of time in our own finance section. So as soon as it's ready, we'll report on it, but it's not quite final yet. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's taken so much time is in part because there were so few records to go on. And one of the problems we faced is that in addition to the student levy, the SMCSU governments were taking in a great deal of cash from club nights and from other activities, and record keeping was not what it should have been. Mm-hmm. And so we're just trying to see if we can trace what happened and provide a report to the students of St. Michael's about how their money has been spent over the last 5 years. The most important thing for me that comes from the forensic report is it'll be disheartening but important to know if and how money was taken. But more important will be, and we've already started on this, we had started working on this with SMCSU this year, to come up with a completely new way of managing money that's much more transparent, much more efficient, and where records are kept, and students can determine how and where their money is being spent. Because that just hasn't been part of student life at St. Mike's for 5 or 6 years or more. I don't know beyond the scope of the investigation. But this is really an opportunity to be transparent and to turn the page.
Okay. I wanted to ask as well, part of what we're doing here as part of this podcast series is reflecting on what we've covered and things that have appeared in our paper. So a little while ago, an op-ed was published in our paper by Jess Afonso, who is the former vice president of SMCSU. And we received a short response from the University of St. Michael's College on that op-ed, saying that some of the things that she had said about SMCSU and about the administration as well were unsubstantiated or untrue. I was wondering if, first of all, if you had read that op-ed, if you had any response to it that you might be able to provide for us today.
I had read the op-ed. I was disappointed by it because I thought it represented, this is someone who's come out of this political turmoil, and she was offering her own personal take on it. And what disappointed me, frankly, in the way the varsity handled that was that there was no effort. It was printed in the opinion pages, so nobody called in advance to say, all these things are being said, do you have any disagreement with it? I thought that would be a much fairer way of handling this. It wasn't an op-ed. She wasn't opining on student government in general. It was a sort of a personal defense and apologia. And I don't think that's the appropriate use of the protection of the opinion pages. I think that should have been exposed to much more rigorous journalistic skepticism and exposure to alternative perspectives. And we sent in some comments on some of the things that were said, which we thought were either unsubstantiated or untrue. So I think part of the problem here has been that SMCSU officials are sort of waging their their battles or conducting their unfinished business in the pages of the media, most often the varsity. And I'm not sure that's been entirely edifying, because these people are immersed in these battles, and we got to sort of get up to 50,000 feet and look what's happening at St. Mike's, and not get too hung up in the minutiae of the political battles from Ben and Hull.
Right. So could you perhaps elaborate just on that one point? So you're mentioning that, this was Jess's particular perspective on things, and perhaps it wasn't a fulsome picture. We did receive the response that it was that some things were unsubstantiated. Everything we do goes through fact checked.
But you didn't fact check. I mean, you should at least ask some of the people who represent the other side of that discussion. Other people in SMCSU, I could think of a lot of people you might have asked. That didn't happen. That's okay. But there were some things in there that I thought were inaccurate, and some people whose reputations were hurt as a result of what was said in the piece. So, and in some cases, the author neglected to mention her own, the fact that she was involved in some of the discussions or some of the events that she described. It was a little, the sort of self-disclosure, self-interest part of it wasn't always evident either. It was a very strong and well-written political attack, but not one that should have been printed without an airing of alternative views.
Right. So, yeah, you did mention that it was an opinion piece, strong,
that reflected strong. I write a lot of opinion pieces for the Globe, and if I make an unsupported assertion, the Globe editors say we're going to have to check and get a second source on that, and I actually don't do that because I spend a lot of time writing opinion pieces and I think about it. So my opinion pieces generally take a broader look at things, and I try not to fight bureaucratic battles that I was engaged in Afghanistan or China. So I think you just have to be a little careful there. There are opinion pieces, and then there is kind of invective and score setting and things like that. And sometimes pieces can cross the line into that sort of personal, subjective territory.
Okay. Well, we'd be very interested, of course, in hearing a more elaborate response if you're ever wanting to write an op-ed in the varsity as well.
Sure. Well, the next step will be when we make the results of the audit, or we provide an account of what the audit covered, and so there may be an opportunity then.
Right, absolutely. Is there anything that I haven't asked at this point that you think I should have asked, or that you would like students to know about what's coming up for SMC and SMCSU and all the rest?
The thing, I guess, what strikes me after a year and a half being president of St. Mike's and being part of this larger community is that there is a sort of a majority view in Canadian life, increasingly, and a majority view which is a very secular view. And I get that, and I live in the secular world, and I understand the secular world. But what worries me is that secular perspective sometimes seems unable or unwilling to understand that there are other perspectives. And so the response of the secular world often is, you have to do everything and be exactly what we are, or you're intolerant. And I think Canada's a lot more interesting if other perspectives are heard on. We will always provide a perspective at St. Mike's for those who seek a deeper and maybe more religiously serious interpretation of the world. Does that mean that we're resolutely Catholic? Not at all. We've got Salman Rushdie coming to speak at St. Mike's at the end of this month. Do we have Catholic speakers? We have that too. But we're interested in this larger canvas. And sometimes I find that the unintended consequence of living next and as part of a big secular world is this inability to understand or to appreciate or to extend mutual accommodation to those who represent what is a minority position, but is a very valid position too, and that is as valid as the majority position. So we always have to struggle a little harder to occupy the space that we occupy, but we'll always do that.
Very good. Okay. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. Post-Mortem is produced by Aidan Curry for the Varsity's Features section. Video content is by Shaq Hossein. Next week, I sit down with Dalia Hashim, president of the Muslim Students Association, as we discuss how President Trump's ban on Muslims has affected students here at U of T.